So we're going to hear from Andres Terizo, Nisha Nadkarni, and a few slides from Eric Roy. Andres is a principal at Watershed Consulting. He has particular interest and expertise with green stormwater infrastructure, watershed planning, and stormwater retrofit design. Andres earned his undergrad degree in geological sciences from Tufts University and his master's degree in geography from the University of Colorado Boulder. For over 20 years, Andres has been actively working on improving water quality with a variety of clients and partners throughout the United States. Nisha Nadkarni is a water resources scientist at Watershed Consulting. Nisha focuses on stormwater master planning, water quality monitoring, best management practices assessments, and engineering feasibility analyses. Nisha is a graduate of the environmental science program at UVM's Rubenstein School. She had a concentration in ecological design and geospatial technologies. Eric is an assistant professor of environmental sciences focusing on ecological design. He is also with the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. Eric leads the Nutrient Cycling and Ecological Design Lab at UVM, where they are working at the interface of ecology and engineering and focusing on water, food systems, and resources management. Thank you all for being here today. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Juliana. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. My name's Andres Terizo, and so we're going to take you through our project here where we monitored 2 gravel wetlands for the 20 and 21 field seasons, but then maybe most importantly, share some of the ongoing project work that we've been doing, which was related to some of the findings that came out of this study. So go ahead, next slide. So this project was a collaboration with us being Watershed Consulting, the University of Vermont, and also some advisors, City of South Burlington, Village of Essex Junction, and then Jason Booth from Aldrich and Elliott. And this was a project funded by Lake Champlain Sea Grant. So we're going to go over quickly the current design specifications for gravel wetlands in the Vermont Stormwater Manual, the 2017 Vermont Stormwater Manual. I'm going to talk about just our field configuration and our findings. Nisha will take us through that. We'll review some of the key conclusions from the study and then really get into our recommendations for the solutions, and then also just to present some case studies. So quickly, and I know there's a lot of experts probably on the line, so we won't really spend a lot of time with this, but just to refresh on how a gravel wetland works. So it's a horizontal filter. So water is coming in, most typically through a forebay, and then directed into a subsurface gravel layer, where through hydraulic head basically gets pushed through that gravel layer horizontally through the stone. And then to an outlet structure, and the outlet structure being raised essentially so that the gravel underneath the wetland stays saturated at all times and produces kind of this constructed wetland, basically sustains wetland plants on the surface. And so the treatment is occurring through biologic, chemical, physical processes as the water flow is flowing horizontally through the stone, and then also providing flow detention when the water is able to pond up above the wetland surface. So the 2017 Vermont Stormwater Manual has gravel wetlands identified. So they're identified as tier 2 practice. So what that means is the new manual is structured in tiers, meaning that the manual guides you towards tier 1, which are infiltration-based practices first. And if you cannot do infiltration on site, you need to be looking at a tier 2 practice. And so gravel wetlands are included in tier 2 practice. So really they're now the go-to type best management practices for sites where infiltration is not feasible. Next. So tier 2 practices are expected to achieve a high pollutant removal rate, 60 to 80% total phosphorus, 80 to 97% TSS removal. And the treatment volume, or TV credit, is basically calculated by, it's the storage within the gravel, so within the voids of the gravel itself, and then also above the wetland surface. So we're focused for our treatment aspects, we're focused on the 1-inch storm, the water quality storm. So we are, to size a gravel wetland properly, we're going to be managing that 1-inch storm volume within the gravel wetland, both within the voids of the stone and then also above the surface. So the manual currently has some key specifications, basically that the inlet pipe shall be set at either end of the permanent pool, but that's not really relevant for a gravel wetland. There is no permanent pool. So it's really at the base of the gravel bed. So that's really specific to the gravel wetland. There's also other constructed wetland options in the manual. Stormwater shall be conveyed from the surface down to the subsurface perforated distribution lines. So the water comes down from the surface and then gets distributed within perforated under drains through the gravel layer. And then subsurface water level shall be maintained in the gravel wetland through the design of the outlet elevation. So that's what I was saying, the outlet being perched so that the water within remains saturated within the stone at all times. So as I had mentioned before, this water quality volume, which is the volume generated during the 1-inch 24-hour storm, is stored in a combination of gravel storage and also extended detention. The extended detention shall not exceed 50% of the water quality volume. So that's just one of the limitations in the manual. The manual calls for treatment cells having a length to width ratio of 1:1 or greater, and then the minimum flow path being 15 feet within the wetland. So this is all focused on really making sure that the length that the water flows through the gravel is sufficiently long to get desired treatment. So there's some key aspects in the manual which are absent. So for example, the manual is silent on whether you need to have 1 or 2 cells, possibly more cells than that. The wetland soil muck, the phosphorus content, the organic content, and also the saturated hydraulic conductivity. So the wetland muck is a real focus of our research. So we're going to get into that. There's no mention of chloride. That's kind of a side that we're not going to get into too much. That was looked at as part of this study, but we're not going to cover that today. And then any specifications on the actual gravel, the size, gradation, the type of stone, whether it be limestone, granite, etc. Next. So because of the gaps in the current manual, designers have looked towards other manuals. This is one, the UNH manual. So I referenced when we first did our first gravel wetland, I think in 2007, we used the first generation of this manual. So these were developed by the UNH Stormwater Center. So they've put out a couple versions of this manual here. So this manual specifically calls out having the muck be a low hydraulic conductivity soil, having a minimum of greater than 15% organic matter in the muck, and then clay not to exceed 15% that may result in drying and cracking. Next. So in terms of the phosphorus index of the muck, this is actually from North Carolina State. So this was the reason that we're highlighting this phosphorus index for the soil must be low, between 10 and 30 milligrams per kilogram. This is a spec for bioretention soil, but it has been adopted on some recent designs, including the 2 projects that we're going to present on today, where we've done our monitoring as a standard that has been used for the muck specifications, because there was really no other specific phosphorus standard. So this is one that has been adopted before. Next. So this study is important because gravel wetlands within the permitted environment have really proliferated substantially. There's about 100, there's more than 100 now permitted under the 2017 Stormwater Manual, which is the new manual. So there's a lot, and they're really there's a lot more kind of in process right now with all the focus on stormwater retrofitting. So there's a need for permitting review and approval consistency. So there's a lot of confusion because of the absence of some of these specifications from designers and reviewers about what is appropriate, what is not. And there's, in terms of the muck, there is really the variation in local vendor materials not well described. So when you're getting your muck from one location or another, you may be getting a very different product. So I think that there's a need to have better understanding of the actual composition of the products that are being received. So the research questions that we really focused on are, do gravel wetlands that are being permitted under the 2017 manual perform as expected for both flow attenuation and for phosphorus capture? Because the two that we studied are put in place for both purposes, controlling flow, but also capturing phosphorus. There was a lab component to this. Eric Roy is on, and he really headed up the lab piece. So we're going to touch on that a little bit, but mainly we're going to be focusing on the field components. So I think at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Nisha, and she can take us through the experimental design and some of our results.
So we investigated 2 different sites. Our first site is located at Kennedy Drive in South Burlington by the airport. And this area is much more commercialized and has some industrial parks surrounding this drainage area. Total drainage area was about 8.6 acres, with most of it being impervious cover, about 6 acres. And this is just an overview photo of how the wetland is configured. So we have inflow coming through a stone line swale along Kennedy Drive. And this inflow enters sediment forebay. And this particular wetland has 2 treatment cells. So the inflow comes from the forebay into the first treatment cell and is spread through perforated distribution pipes. And then it does enter the second cell for additional treatment. And then it enters a solid pipe shown in orange, where it travels to the outlet riser and then discharges to a wetland tributary of Potash Brook. The second site we looked at for monitoring is located in Essex Junction, and this drainage area is primarily residential. And this drainage area compared to Kennedy Drive is a bit bigger. So we're looking at 23 acres and a smaller portion of that being impervious, close to 4 acres. And the configuration of this wetland is a little bit different. So we have 1 treatment cell and we have 4 inlet points. The first 2 on the right side of the screen are coming into the inlet, where it enters the inlet riser, and the inlet riser brings this flow to a hydraulic inlet. And the hydraulic inlet also receives 2 additional inlet points on the right side of the screen in the top. And the top, you can see that road is Route 15. And then the right or the left side arrow is coming from the residential street. So all of that inflow passes through the hydraulic inlet and travels across the treatment cell in the perforated distribution pipes. And then it enters solid pipe through the outlet riser. So for our field setup, we are going to just talk about the flow configuration today. So we used automated samplers, ISCOs in particular, to monitor flow as well as to take samples throughout a storm event. And depending on the storm size, the frequency and the amount of sample taken was variable depending on the storm characteristics. So this is just a photo of what it kind of looks like in action during a storm. And looking inside the riser, we have several sensors monitoring water level in order to cross-check that these data sets are accurate. More action photos for our culverts. We had Thelmar weirs measuring flow, and then that Thelmar weir is connected to the ISCO on the right, which is feeding it real-time flow measurements and taking samples at the same time. This slide is showing our monitoring summary for the field seasons 2020 and 2021. So our target range for monitoring was June to October. And a little bit into November for the second field season. And for each season, we monitored, our goal was to monitor at least 10 storms in order to get complete data sets. So we ended up monitoring a little bit more than that, 16 in 2020 and 12 in 2021, and our average rainfall 2 years ago was 0.80 inches, and our average rainfall was a little bit higher last year with a little over 1 inch of rain. So out of those 16 and 12 storms from each respective year, I've just pulled a couple of hydrographs just to show the performance of some of these storms. This is an example of a storm we monitored last July at the Kennedy Drive wetland. And we have the inflow modeled in blue, and the outlet graph is shown in brown. The total inflow was 22,000 cubic feet, and the modeled outflow was 18,000 or closer to 19,000 cubic feet. And you can see from the shape of the graph that we have that very prominent peak flow coming in, and then we see that the flow attenuation is acting the way we want it to, and we see a nice sustained outflow. It's very low on the graph. You can see a sustained line showing the outflow. And in terms of how this compares to the modeled flows that we calculated in HydroCAD, which is the software we use to determine what these inflows and outflows will be, it actually modeled pretty similarly to the model, which was 21,000 cubic feet. And we did see in this particular storm that total phosphorus actually decreased by 53%. And this is a little chart summarizing all of the storms between 2020 and 2021. And we can focus on the numbers outlined in red. And this is showing the percent reduction efficiency for the Kennedy Drive wetland in flow volumes. So we did actually see in the storm categories up until the 2-inch storm that there was actually flow reductions. And we'll talk a little bit more in the conclusions that the system is not actually designed to reduce flow, but we just happen to notice that with the raw data summarized in this table. And then this is one hydrograph showing shown from the Fairview Drive wetland. This was a storm back in 2020. This was a larger 2-inch storm. And we had 57,000 cubic feet come in from our 3 monitored inlet points. And this particular storm, we saw there was a lot of retention in this system, and we only saw about 33,000 cubic feet or closer to 34,000 cubic feet come out. And compared to the modeled flows, we actually saw a lot less come in compared to the model, which was closer to 63,000 cubic feet. And in this storm, we did see TP loading decrease by 50%. This is the flow volume comparisons for all of the Fairview Drive storms. And I did want to point out that our sample sizes are pretty small. We had a limited number of complete data sets due to various equipment malfunctions. So we were working with the complete data sets that we had, and based off of those, we separated them out into these 4 storm categories. And in all 4 of them, we actually saw percent reduction efficiency that were pretty high in each storm category. So at least 40% and above. Now getting into the pollutant loading and the reductions efficiencies that we measured, we have a box plot on the right here, and this is focused on the Kennedy Drive wetlands. And this box plot shows chloride, TSS, total dissolved phosphorus, and total phosphorus. And for the sake of time, we'll just look at the TDP and TP section, but we did see for year 1 and year 2, which are year 1 is in the peach color and blue is year 2, that TDP exports were far greater than the imports, as well as for the TP exports exceeding TP imports. And similarly to the Fairview Drive box plots we have here, we did see that TDP and TP loading was again higher leaving the wetland than coming in both years. And particularly in year 2, we actually did see higher exports than in year one, which was 2020. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about the lab portion and talk a bit more about why we were seeing those results. And these are just some site photos just to show what the wetlands looked like post-construction to fall 2021. So Kennedy Drive, we didn't have time to talk about the vegetation today, but the vegetation did struggle to establish in this area, and we did eventually see some growth later on, but it did take a while compared to Fairview, which was again in the more residential area, and we saw the vegetation establish pretty well here. So I'm gonna bring it over to Eric to talk a little bit about the lab portion and focus a bit more on wetland soil muck component.
Thanks. Thank you, Nisha. So as Andres and Nisha mentioned, our study included both the field component and the lab component. And I think that's really nice because, you know, with the field study, we get this, you know, net P reduction or not at the field scale, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why we see what we see. So we use some lab work to help open the black box, so to speak, and look at the different materials that are being used within these systems. And one of the materials we focused on was the muck material that Andres talked about earlier on in this presentation. And so we conducted a series of experiments, 2 experiments, using column setups, and these column setups were designed to help mimic what is happening, or at least what is supposed to be happening out in the field. If you could click once, Nisha. So in these experiments, we used a synthetic stormwater. So this synthetic stormwater included 0.2 milligrams phosphorus per liter as orthophosphate, as well as some nitrate and ammonium and chloride at concentrations that have been observed in the field in Vermont. And so we use this synthetic stormwater in a series of triplicate columns for each treatment, also including controls. And what I mean by control here is these were blank columns that did not include any muck material, but were subjected to the same experimental conditions. This helps us make sure that it's not our experiment that's causing the change, but actually the material. If you could advance one. And so for each column, we simulated 6, in quote, storms. So these are simulated events where we added synthetic stormwater to achieve an 8-inch ponding depth, which is the depth we would expect to see in the field. We held that for an hour to allow chemical equilibrium, and then we initiated a draining process, a slow draining process, while maintaining that 8-inch ponding depth. So each storm volume was about 3 liters. If you could click. Okay, and here are the take-home results from these experiments. So we did 2 experiments. The first one is shown here in yellow, the yellow box plots. And so we have 1 control for that experiment. So again, that's a blank column, not including the muck material. And then we tested 3 engineered mucks, EM1, EM2, and EM3. These were all provided by relatively local suppliers who were given the specs that were in the previous version of the stormwater manual, or at least the existing specs there. And they created a material that they gave to us and we tested it. Just so you know, the material EM1 was the material used in the field sites that Nisha was referring to before. So in that first experiment, the one in yellow, we saw significantly greater export of soluble reactive phosphorus from the muck columns compared to the control columns, especially, well, actually for 2 of the muck columns, the EM1 and EM2. So 2 of these materials exported a significant amount of phosphorus, while the third material did not. We decided to follow up this experiment with the second one, where we tested the EM1 material after it had been in the field for approximately 1 year. And we also wanted to understand how these results compared to native soils at the sites. And so in that second experiment, the take-home result was that even after a year in the field, that engineered muck 1 still had greater SRP export in the column experiments than the 2 native soils from each site. Another thing that I would like to mention that's not on this slide is we also tested the hydraulic conductivity of these materials. All engineered mucks far exceeded the target saturated hydraulic conductivity, meaning that water is likely to actually move through these materials as opposed to pooling on top and draining through the perforated riser pipes as intended. So we take this as a good indication that the muck materials, especially if you were to use either EM1 or EM2 that we tested, could be a very likely source of the excess phosphorus that Nisha and Andres were seeing in the field study.
Thanks, Eric.
I'll just go over our conclusions for the field component before handing it back to Andres. So as I had mentioned back, showing the flow volume comparisons, we did see that we were noticing a lot of retention of the flow volume in all of the storm categories up until the 2-inch storm, even though both systems were not originally designed to reduce these flow volumes. But we do see that the fields, that particularly the Fairview Drive system was very effective at retaining these volumes. And both systems were really effective at attenuating flows from the 0 to 1-inch storms. And then going back to the phosphorus conversation and why we were noticing exports that were exceeding the imports, we are seeing that in the first 2 years that the exports have been increasing compared to year 1. And looking at the timeline for how long this will happen, we expect that with extended monitoring of TP and TDP within this system, it would be interesting to determine how long this flushing period would last until the wetlands start retaining enough phosphorus to observe the desired P load reductions, which Andres had mentioned should be between 60 and 80% TP removal referenced in the stormwater manual. And I'm going to hand it over to Andres to talk a little bit about solutions for this performance.
Thanks, Nisha. So I think one of the most interesting findings that we that came out of, I think, the research that we've done was really the use of native soils to limit the introduction of nutrients, to save cost and to reduce unnecessary carbon emissions by truck materials. So it seems like a novel idea, but I think progressively designers have been really focused on engineered mixes, importing engineered mixes, but in a lot of cases where the conditions are right, native soils can definitely be appropriate, and I think they're calibrated well to the site in terms of the phosphorus content. So they're not going to have that high level of phosphorus in a lot of cases. So they're really a good resource to use. Secondly, I think incorporating a higher clay content in a absolute minimum organic content to support the plant growth really makes sense. So that higher clay content, UNH manual specifies a limit because of potential issues with contaminating the gravel layer and cracking of the clay material. But we still think that really could be offset by the fact that clay is just low nutrients and a really low hydrologic conductivity, which is important, really important to prevent short circuiting. So I think that's really important. In terms of the P-index testing method, Mehlich-3 test and subsequent PSR test of the Mehlich-3 extraction shall be used to measure phosphorus. So that is a deviation from what the manual currently is specifying, a modified Morgan's method. Mehlich-3 PSR for the wetland soil should be no more than 0.10. And then the hydrologic conductivity or hydraulic conductivity, excuse me, maintaining that very low conductivity, 0.01 to 0.1 feet per day. And just on the right there is just the calculation of how to calculate the PSR with iron and aluminum and phosphorus. Next. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of gravel wetlands that are currently in place in the ground in Vermont. So one strategy may be to actually test the mucks to evaluate whether or not P leaching may be occurring, depending on that PSR ratio. And there may be, we're not going to get into it today, but there are other experiments ongoing, I know, that are studying amendments to enhance the P removal capabilities of certain types of BMP. So using things like water treatment residuals or the St. George black shale material, which we tested in the ag environment that works really well. There are definitely some good opportunities to incorporate some of those things in systems where maybe the muck is resulting in phosphorus leaching currently. The other thing that's going on is working on a new guidance document, which is really outside of the regulatory manual. The state stormwater section doesn't have the capability right now to update the manual, but there's been discussing basically just generating a new FAQ type document that would be available to designers with this information in there to just provide that guidance so people can take advantage of it now. And that's hopefully going to be at some time in the near future. That's being headed up by the GI Roundtable. So just quickly, I'm just going to run through these two case studies. These are two projects that are, the first project here is at U32 High School in Montpelier. This is a project that was just constructed about a month ago. So this is a site where it's required to comply with 9050 operational stormwater permits. It's a regulated 3-acre site. So subject to retrofit. The design here is it's a one cell design. There's a 4-bay for pretreatment. The system's designed to treat greater than 50% of the water quality volume. So that's half an inch of rain in 24 hours. And one of the constraints is that this site does border a state regulated class 2 wetland. So there was some wetland permitting involved to actually get it constructed. So just some photos there. This is just a close-up of the muck soil. So this is a site where local soils were used, and the local soils were amended actually with a peat to get the final muck material. So this is just a close-up of that. Yeah, if you back up one, just to kind of give the setting here. On the left is the NRCS soils map. So just showing that all the red are D soils. So we were expecting them to be heavy, and that's why we chose the gravel wetland, and indeed they were. And then on the right is the drainage map. So the gravel wetland that was designed manages impervious acreage of 5.72 acres. Total drainage area is just over 14 acres. Next. Just a close-up of the native soils on the right. So you can see it's a real clay-based material. There were stones, and so the soils needed to be screened on site. We mixed in a pretty low percentage of this peat, which was on the left, is very dry, fluffy type material. Just integrated a little bit of that into the final mix, just to give a little more organic to get the grass grown, but just at absolute minimum. So this material was tested, the PSR value 0.04, which is below the value of 0.1. So that checks the box. Next. Second site is at the Burlington Country Club. So this is right off of Spear Street. So this is a project that's ongoing right now. Again, the BCC, the Country Club, is required to comply with 9050 operational stormwater permit requirements. The unique thing about this is that it also is a project that was scoped originally as part of the Potash Brook Flow Restoration Plan. So it's also helping the city of South Burlington meet their flow-based TMDL targets. So it's it's a wetland that's designed not only for water quality treatment, but also for channel protection volume control, which is the 1 year storm. So we're looking a little over 2 inches of rain. This is just the drainage map. In purple on the right of the map is the drainage area for the wetlands. So it treats, you know, some impervious from the golf course, but also, you know, a large chunk of Spear Street from about UVM south to past the Miller Farm. You can see on the right, just north of Potash Brook. 5.24 acres of impervious area. Just a note on the soils. The soils were actually, the pink area is actually hydrologic soil group A. On the left, if you see the SN001 point, the gravel wetlands located fairly close to that corner. So it was actually located on soils that are mapped as A. However, based on on-site soils testing, the soils were heavy clay. So it was the reason why we selected the gravel wetlands. Next. Just a site plan here. So this is a one cell treatment system. This system has a proprietary pretreatment inlet. As I had mentioned, it designed to manage the channel protection storm. And there were some wetland permitting associated with this, some small class 3 wetlands in the area where the constructed wetland is going to be. And it's kind of a unique project because it's integrated in within the golf course as a feature on the golf course. And it's a really good example of a public-private partnership with the city and a private landowner to meet multiple goals, helping the club meet their goals and helping the city meet their flow restoration goals. So this is real time. So these are yesterday. The objective here, I believe, is to utilize 100% native soils for the muck. So the soils were tested by the University of Maine. Test came back with a PSR value of 0.013, so well below the 0.1 value. It's a heavy soil, very low conductivity soil. So it checks the box in terms of that wetland muck. So we don't have quantified numbers to provide, but you know, it's a really, both of these are a really good example of ways to utilize that native material and prevent a lot of trucking of material over the roads and a lot of excess cost. And you know, simplifies the project and also achieves the goal of keeping a low phosphorus soil, which is, you know, at least going to sustain some plants, but not be overly likely to leach phosphorus. Just some quick acknowledgements. Dave Wheeler from City of South Burlington was extremely helpful on the project, and Maddie and from our office as well, extremely helpful. And then you can see the list of the other acknowledgements. And we'd like to thank Sea Grant for the project. And I think at this point, I think we have some time for some questions if there are.